Hello and welcome to my garden. My name is Jolene and today's video is a bit different than my normal content. You're in for a treat. This is Liam, my son. The video you're about to see is a very special one. My father, David Stottlemyre, gave lectures around the country on gardening with the beginner gardener in mind. I grew up traveling around the country, mostly on the West Coast, listening to my dad give this seminar series, and my sister and I heard them so many times that we always said we could recite them by heart because we knew where all his jokes were, we knew where the different things he said, and so it holds a really special place in my heart. Finally, after many years of him giving these lectures, he put these lectures into a 5-part DVD series, and that's what you're watching today, one part of the series. Sadly, my dad passed to his rest in 2013 after a 4-year battle with thyroid cancer. To honor his legacy, our family has decided to release this 5-part DVD series onto YouTube for anyone to access and glean from his knowledge. If you would like to own this 5-part DVD series, then email me in the description down below. I have my email address down there, and we'd be happy to mail you one for the price of $24.99, which includes the shipping and the cost of the DVD. We hope you're blessed by this seminar.
So we're going to talk now about plant propagation and more. So this is going to cover plant propagation. It's going to cover greenhouses. We're going to talk a little bit about grafting. Kind of a lump all together sort of a talk. My wife, it's been suggested that I actually do one totally on greenhouses, so I think I might work one up just on greenhouses, because there's a lot of people that are interested in greenhouses up here. And I used to teach a class in greenhouses, and I ran 2 greenhouses when I was at Bossier University. And so we could easily work something up on just talking about greenhouses, because there's so much really when it comes to greenhouses. Topics to be covered. Talk about plant propagation, greenhouses, pruning. Here's a verse. And Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard right after getting off the ark. Of course, that didn't turn out well because he ended up getting drunk and had some problems. But we see that Abraham also, he planted a grove in Beersheba. Now it's interesting because Abraham was promised that this land would be his. And yet, did he ever inherit any of it during his lifetime? The Bible says he had not a place to put his foot on. None of it was his, and yet he took the time to plant a grove. That shows faith. He believed in the Word of God. God said, this land is going to be yours, and he planted trees. You have to wait a while before you get anything out of a tree, huh? And he called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Another verse. And what man is he that hath planted a vineyard, and hath not eaten of it? Let him also go and return unto his house, lest he die in the battle, and another man eat of it. This is interesting because this is talking about calling men to war. But if they've planted a vineyard and haven't had a chance to eat, send them back home. Give them a chance to let that crop mature and eat a little bit of it before you go fight. Now, I think that's interesting because over and over we see in the history of Israel that the battle is not won by numbers. You notice that? Like Gideon, David and Goliath, little guy against a big guy. We see it in the time of Asa, and all over through the Old Testament you see God can work through a few men or women of faith. And faith is what? It's one of the fruits of the Spirit, a fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness. And we need to have that fruit in our life before we go fight a battle. So let's talk a little bit about plant propagation. 2 different types, sexual propagation and asexual. First, sexual is with seeds, results in plants that may be similar and not identical, but similar, or they can be different than the parent. If it's an open pollinated plant, when you collect the seed, the resulting plants will be very similar to the parent. If it's something like fruit, like avocado, and you plant the seed and it grows, it's going to be different because they're a cross, a hybrid. Then you have asexual propagation. This results in plants that are, at least genetically, identical to the parent plant. And this would be like your grafting and cutting and things like that. And there's a place for both. Talk about seeds first. If it's self-pollinated, the offspring are similar to the parent. For the home gardener, use varieties that are heirloom or open pollinated. And we mentioned a little bit about that before when talking about hybrids and seed. Cross-pollinated seed, the offspring are genetically different from the parents. That's why they're called hybrid. And one reason why they do that, have hybrid seed on purpose, is because when you have a hybrid, oftentimes the resulting plant is more vigorous or can tolerate wider climate conditions because it inherits from the two parents traits that in combination make for a good plant. But sometimes you also lose in the process because man tends to breed for certain characteristics. It may not be flavor, or it may not be the nutrient value. They may breed a plant that'll grow in a wide area and will be transported easily on a truck and won't be damaged, but when you go to taste it, it doesn't have much flavor because they didn't really breed it for flavor. They bred it for something else. You know, it's interesting, and because I worked with avocados, there's two different breeding programs for avocados, two completely separate breeding programs. The one I worked with was breeding program for the fruit, where we worked with, you know, the size and the color and the flavor of it. And then there was a completely different breeding program for the roots, trying to develop a root stock that would work well and resist salt and this and that, because it is so hard to get a good fruit and it is so hard to get a good root that to try to get both with the same thing doesn't work. I mean, you would never get anything at all. Okay, if you're going to start seeds, what do you need? What are the materials you need? You need some sort of a growing container. I'm talking here about starting seeds mainly indoors or in a greenhouse or something like that. Planting mix, light source, water, and you need the correct temperature. If possible, you use some sort of a pot that's sterile, because damping off caused by an organism, your plant will germinate and then it'll die. You can run, if you have like plastic pots, some plastic pots you can run through the dishwasher and that'll help to sterilize them. You can use a 10% bleach solution. I prefer to use peat pots if I can. I brought a few here. Most of you probably are familiar with these, but they come sterile and they break down over time. The roots will just grow right through them, and you could start your plants or transplant them into a pot like this. There are a lot of different ones. There's some pictures, round and square. Oh, I'm sorry. This is kind of a variation on the theme of a peat pot. This is the same type of material, but they come in these little styrofoam slots. And it's a little peat insert that sits down in here, and it has a little hole in the middle, and you just put a single seed in each one. And then as the plant grows up, you can just lift the plant out, and the whole thing just comes out. And it helps reduce your transplant shock too, because you're not messing with the roots much. You just stick it down into the ground. I hope I put that back in the right spot. And I number them here and label them along the sides so that I have a key that tells me what I have in each, because I don't need a whole tray of one thing. That's a lot of like broccoli or collards. You know, we eat collards, but we wouldn't eat that much. Maybe some of you would, in which case I have 3 or 4 of these, and so I constantly have new stuff starting for my garden. Planting mix, you want to use some sort of a light potting mix or seedling mix. Sometimes some of the ones that are labeled potting soil are actually a little too heavy to use for your seedlings. So if you're buying something from a store, some sort of a mix, make sure it's either a light potting mix or a seedling mix. Garden soil usually doesn't work very well in something like this, because garden soil, for one thing, it's not sterile. Although you were saying you can't sterilize it in the microwave. It smells pretty bad, I understand. But the other problem with regular soil is it tends, when you take it out of its natural environment, out of the garden, it tends to compact, and then the water doesn't pass through it very well. And so you have a drainage problem. So it's very hard to use soil in one of these little starting pots. It's better to use some sort of a potting mix, or you could even use a compost. Some people will use compost, which is not sterile, but it does work. You could use Jiffy 7 or 9 peat pots. They look like this, and you put them in water and they swell up, and they get about yay big, and they're real nice for starting seeds. The Jiffy 7 and the Jiffy 9, the difference between the numbers, one of them has a little like a plastic type netting that goes around it, the other one doesn't. Then if you cover the seeds with a little bit of potting soil or vermiculite, although I understand vermiculite's hard to get nowadays because it supposedly has asbestos in it, and it's, anyway. You know what vermiculite is? Vermiculite, it's mica, what they've heated up and it expands. Okay, so you cover it up. Again, 4 times the width of the seed. Remember, if it's a bigger seed, you plant it deeper. It's as simple as that. Then you want some sort of a light source. If available, natural light's the best. Fluorescent lights, about 12 to 16 hours a day. And you want to adjust the lighting so that you have a little space, but not too much, between the top of the plant and the bottom of the light. You want a nice bright light, because otherwise the plants tend to want to get leggy. And by the way, that brings up another point. This little seed starting system I have here, see, I have this little lid that goes on the top, and this lid has you can open it to allow however much humidity you want in here by controlling whether this is open or closed. But the thing I've noticed is after the seedlings get up about this tall or so, you've got to take this off. Otherwise, they want to just shoot up and get real tall and leggy, and then they fall over. So I put this on just for the seeds to germinate and just break out, start to grow, and then I have to take this off and get the light down close to this. Otherwise, the plants just want to get real tall and leggy real quick. So what do we need as far as water? You want to keep the soil moist but not drenched until the seedlings emerge. A lot of different ways of doing this. You can use a little mist sprayer, capillary matting, or just setting the container in a tray of warm water. That works nice for this system again, because I have a built-in little tray here. Okay, you can see the tray underneath, and you just put some water in the bottom until it comes up, let it soak, it soaks up in, and then after, maybe an hour or 2, you can pour the water off and let it drain, and it doesn't get too wet. Nice little, so you don't have to do something like that. I'm just showing you an example of something that worked for me. You want the correct temperature. Now, some seeds need to be fairly warm in order to germinate. If you have a greenhouse, a couple people here have talked about their greenhouses. That's a very nice place to start your seedlings. Those of you that don't have a greenhouse, if you keep your house warm enough, you can do it in your house. I don't have a greenhouse yet, so I do it upstairs. We have a little, like a thing that sticks out of the kitchen, and it gets some nice sunlight. And I can put my seeds in there and start them, and it stays warm enough. Room temperature is usually pretty good, depending upon how warm you keep your room. Or you can have a heating mat. Now, I have a heating mat. This is my first year to use a heating mat. I finally bought a heating mat because it does get kind of cold up here at times. And the heating mat will keep the temperature 8 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature. You understand what I'm saying? The room temperature, whatever it is, it'll be 8 degrees warmer than that. So we tend to run our house in the morning, it'll be 69 or 70, we have wood heat. And so this will keep it around 77 or 78 degrees. If you're colder than that, again, you just add 8 degrees to whatever your temperature is, and that's what the heating mat will give you. And this worked really nice for starting my seeds. And the other thing I noticed that my wife loves cilantro. And cilantro seems to be very sensitive to temperature, especially cool temperature. And I've had trouble germinating cilantro seeds for some reason. And with this heating mat, I got one to germinate. And then she bought a little pot with some cilantro in it, and it was dying. We had it in our window, and it was dying. And I stuck it on the heating mat, and it just perked right up. Now, unfortunately, it got aphids and then died. But anyway, it did perk up when I put it on the heating mat. Yeah, I needed some ladybugs. Oh, I didn't tell the story about how they collect ladybugs. Oh, well, I'll tell that maybe at the end. Remind me if you want to hear the ladybug, how they collect ladybugs. Okay, if you have a greenhouse, another good way of starting seeds. Then you can do asexual propagation. We've been talking about seeds there. You can also propagate plants asexually by taking divisions or cuttings or doing grafting. Let's talk about division. Crown division is where you take where the roots join the stem and you divide it. That's like rhubarb. Take a crown division. I'm only growing rhubarb for the first time. I just planted it for the first time this year. Toughest thing on the earth. Well, that's good to know, I guess.
I threw a root in my driveway and drove over it for 2 years, and someone wanted a rhubarb plant, and I said, there's one, and they took it home, and they said it just flourished. And that was in Soldotna, Alaska.
Well, I'll tell you.
It handled 44 below zero.
Wow. So rhubarb is very tough. Well, I'll tell you one thing that since we moved up here, we've had a lot of rhubarb strawberry pies and different things up here, and my wife's been telling me, I want you to grow rhubarb. Now, see, my Grandma Stottlemyre, she made great pies, but her rhubarb pie was way too tart. And so I wasn't too sure I liked rhubarb until we moved up here, and then we had some rhubarb stuff. And I like tart stuff, but I don't know, maybe, anyway, let's just say that I'm looking forward to seeing my wife's a very good cook, and let's see what she does with the rhubarb that we grow. Suckers, you can divide shoots that sprout from the underground stem. That's like raspberries. Bulbs, you can divide bulbs from the main bulb. Sometimes certain types of bulbs you can take and you can actually split it, cut it right down through the center, and then each section you have to grow it, and it'll take a year or two before it forms a bulb, but you can divide them that way. Tulips, daffodils. Runners, above ground stems that root, like your strawberries. Strawberries tend to produce too many runners. But, and by the way, if you want a lot of strawberries, cut the runners off if you take the time to do it. Now here's a strawberry with a runner. Most of you have seen this before, but you can let this root after a period of time, and then you can separate it from the main plant, or you can allow it to root right where it's at, but separate it and start another batch somewhere else. Layering. Layering is done oftentimes with hard to propagate plants. Now, raspberries are not hard, but you can do a simple layering where you simply bend the stem into the ground and cover it with soil. And here's a picture of it. You just take a branch, bend it down, cover it up, and it'll take root over time. So you can multiply your raspberries using layering, although it'll also send up shoots at the base that you can. You can do air layering. This is where you girdle a 1-year-old branch and you surround it with moist peat moss, and then you wrap it in plastic, and it'll take root. Let's see if I have a picture of that. Yeah, here we go. So you girdle a little bit of the stem here, and you just leave it on the plant. Usually you take a little bit of a rooting hormone and you brush it on, and then you add some peat moss. You wrap the whole thing up with plastic and tie it at either side, and it'll develop roots. Now, I saw a real interesting example of this at the Wild Animal Park in San Diego, they had a very extremely rare tree that they got from the son of I think he had been a missionary in either Morocco or Algeria, and they have these mountains in the desert. You know, it's desert in that area, and they have these mountains, and they have it's a succulent tree, and they're very uncommon. And somehow back when he was there, he got one of these trees and brought it back to the United States. It's the only existing tree of that type outside of where they're grown. They won't let you take them anymore because they're so rare. And here he had this tree, and his son had it in their yard. It was just growing there. And so they called up the San Diego Wild Animal Park, and they said, you know, we got this tree, and they didn't think much of it, but when they went and checked it out, they said, what is this tree? And they looked, and they discovered it was this rare tree that it did not exist outside of this one little area in the desert. And the guy said, well, I'm moving, and we're just going to tear the tree out. And they said, well, we want it. So they dug this tree up, and they took it to the Wild Animal Park. Well, come to find out, the thing starts dying from the roots. They hadn't done their homework, and they didn't realize it had some very specific growing conditions. And it just so happened that in San Diego, where they had planted that thing, it just happened to be just right. But when they moved it to this wild animal park, the roots started dying because the growing media was wrong. And so then they had to rush out and try to figure out, how are we going to grow this, and how are we going to save it from dying? Well, it's a succulent. So they did something really interesting with this tree. They cut the thing off. They built a tripod out of metal, and they put big, strong rope down, and they suspended this tree. It was above ground. It wasn't even attached to the ground at all. And then they cut it off, and they put rooting hormone around it, around the base, and then they put this peat moss. And then on each branch, they did this. What you see right here, they did a little cut like that, and they put some peat moss and some nutrient stuff in there, and they rooted it so that that tree was getting nourishment through every branch and at the base of the tree. And it was trying to root during this time. And meanwhile, they dug down because they had to get rid of all that old soil because it wasn't the right type of soil. And they had to bring in the right type of soil and sterilize the area because, you know, it had some diseases that come in with the rotting roots and stuff. And so when I saw this tree, here was this, and it was probably almost as high as the bottom of this lamp, this tree, and it was just hanging in midair. I mean, nothing attached to the ground. They had it held up with ropes. And they were able to save it using this air layering techniques. Then when they got everything all done, and the bottom of the tree, where the base of the tree would be, it had a few little roots there. They were able to lower that down into the ground and cover it up. And then as that tree grew, they were able to take, you know, where all these things on the side branches were, they were able to cut those off. And then they had this tree. And it's at the Wild Animal Park in San Diego. And most people don't, we went on special tour and they showed us this tree, but they don't let just anybody go see it because it's so rare.
Well, then did each of the branches, did they start another tree?
They did start some just in case something ever happened to this tree. Yeah, they multiplied it. So anyway, that's air layering. So, and air layering can be done with avocado. Avocado is very hard. You can't, it's very hard to propagate avocado, but it will propagate with air layering. Stem cuttings. You can take cuttings from recent growth, usually tented in plastic to preserve water loss. And here's, just take some stems and you put them down inside a pot. And I brought my daughter, Jolene. She did, this is a little stem cutting of, what is this, rosemary? Rosemary, which works with stem cutting fairly nice. And she puts it in this is just a bag from a grocery store, but it's a semi-permeable membrane, these bags that they give you for vegetables, so the air can move in and out. And well, it looks like it fell out, but she kept a little cloth or something in here to give it moisture, and she put this inside and then wrapped it up and kind of tied it so that it stayed moist and humid inside. And this is a little stem cutting, and they put rooting hormone on it and just stuck it down into a potting mix, and it'll eventually root and grow over time. And there are a lot of plants that you can propagate by stem cuttings. You don't have to go out and buy them in a store. If your neighbor has one, you can take a stem cutting and start it. Grafting. Smile. Grafting is where you take a scion or a bud from a desirable plant and graft it onto a rootstock. It's usually done in the spring, and the varieties must be related. Isn't that right? I'm looking at Charlie here because he's helped me a little bit with grafting up here. I've done grafting with avocado, but there's not a lot of demand for that up here.
Budding is usually done in July or
Okay.
August.
Budding is usually done in July or August. Now it's interesting, did you notice it said the plants have to be related? Look at this verse from Romans. For if thou wert cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and wert grafted contrary to nature onto a good olive tree, how much more shall those which be natural branches be grafted onto their own olive tree? And it's talking here about how the Gentiles were grafted into the vine, sort of an idea. But notice the point here is olive tree with olive tree. You know, you don't, even in Bible times, they understood with grafting, you don't graft from an olive tree onto an apple tree because it won't take. They have to be related. They have to be in the same genus species.
Oh, I was going to ask you about pollination. When I lived in Miami, there was a man that lived in Hollywood, another town. He mixed melons with oranges by pollination, I think.
Well, they won't.
They were called melanolas.
Well, I've never heard of that. That's not something I'm aware of. Those two are not close enough to related to do that. He might have been pulling your leg.
People used to go there and buy it.
Oh, really?
Around Christmas time every year.
Because mostly with citrus, if you have something like an orange and a grapefruit, a tangerine, those things, you can cross some of those. But to go outside of citrus, usually it will not be successful. The only way you can move the genes is if you do some of this genetic modification type stuff. So, yeah, pollination is a whole nother subject. You know, talking about bees and the purpose of pollination and how to do that. Grafting. Okay, whip grafting, technique for grafting apples, pears, or other fruits and nuts. That's kind of what Charlie did at my house. My dad liked to graft, and he did a lot of that, and I wish now that I had done more of that when I was living at home and when my dad was still alive. He just liked to go out and graft. All the time he was grafting just to, you know, he had an apple tree that had like 8 or 10 varieties on it just because he wanted to do it and enjoy doing it. He got pretty good at grafting citrus, which is not as easy. There's a lot of different styles of grafting. Here's one where you take and you make an angle and you match the cambium layers, which is the green layer you find under the bark, and you want to match those. You can also do a V-cut, and there's other ones you can do. They wrap it, and in this case they paint it. I don't know if you ever paint it. I've never done that.
Used to use beeswax.
Beeswax? Yeah, we used to use this green tape for the avocado. You just wrap it up with this green tape, and it's sealed really well. I think there was something else. Oh well, I thought I had something else I wanted to show you. It'll come to me in a minute. After I'm long past it, it'll come to me. Let's talk about greenhouses. We have some people here that wanted to learn about greenhouses, and so I have a short section on greenhouses, but like I said, I think I'm going to try to develop a longer talk on greenhouses because there's some interest in that. With greenhouses, I remember what I was going to tell you. You wonder about rooting hormones and starting plants take difficult plants to start. And where did they get rooting hormones from? The history is interesting because it was in England that they used to go out and they would plant a field and then they would take sticks off of trees and they would put them in the ground to make a fence. And normally those sticks would not, I mean, you take a stick off a tree and just stick it in the ground and normally it won't root. But the farmers started noticing that when they planted barley, oftentimes those sticks would take root. And someone realized there must be something in the barley, and what they discovered is the barley seed puts out a natural rooting hormone when it's germinating. And so if you take a stick or a branch, they would put a little notch in the bottom of it. They would take a seed of barley that was germinating, or one that you were going to germinate in the wet soil, and you'd put it in that notch and stick it in the ground, and you would get a fairly low percentage, but you would still get a percentage of those sticks that would root. And that's how they first, before they even knew what rooting hormones were, that's how they used rooting hormones to start cuttings and stuff. Isn't that interesting? Now, greenhouses have an interesting history too. Tiberius Caesar of Rome, I don't know what date this was, but probably BC or AD, right in the time of Christ somewhere. His doctor told him he needed a cucumber per day, every day of the year, in order to be in good health. So Tiberius Caesar, what does he do? He's not going to grow them himself, so he turns to his gardener and tells his gardener that I want a cucumber each day, every day of the year. Now, those of you who grow cucumbers, you know that they don't grow year-round very well. And as a gardener, you don't necessarily want to lose your head. So he started thinking, and what he did was he developed the first greenhouses. He built a pit, and he put compost in the bottom for heat, and then he took sheets of mica, because glass was very expensive back then. It was hard to get a sheet of glass. You just couldn't find glass. But mica, you could find fairly large sheets of mica, and it's transparent. And he put wood and this mica on top to heat this pit up so that he could grow cucumbers. And then when it was warm, he would take the mica off and he would put like silk, really fine cloth over the top. And he was able to grow cucumbers year-round for Tiberius Caesar, who probably still died anyway at some point. But the gardener did not die for lack of trying to grow cucumbers year-round. He was able to do it. Okay, the purposes of a greenhouse, and this is what's important, to know what you're going to use your greenhouse for. A lot of times people will build a greenhouse and then they don't end up using it because they find out it's too expensive to run it, or you know, usually it's a cost problem. So if you're going to have a greenhouse, think through, how are you going to use it? What is its purpose? Plant propagation, or starting plants early in the season, growing tender plants, producing crops off season or out of season, or for a controlled environment. See, with the greenhouse, you could control the environment. So if you have a particular plant, let's say you want poinsettias to bloom at Christmas time, you can make it dark and lower the temperature at the appropriate time to stimulate them to come out of dormancy and to grow, and then you can have poinsettias when normally they wouldn't be looking the way they do. They're not really flowering, but they put out those nice bright leaves. Same thing with growing crops out of season. Now the thing here is, like if you're going to grow something like tomatoes, you need to make sure that is it worth it to keep your greenhouse warm and grow the tomato versus just going down to the store and buying a tomato. See what I'm saying? The tomatoes out of the store may not taste good, but if it's costing you a lot of money to produce a tomato in a greenhouse, it may not be worth it. So you need to know, see, we had at the university, La Sierra, 2 big greenhouses. One of them was given to us by some doctors who, they spent all this money and bought this big greenhouse, and they bought an atomic spectrophotometer so that they could tell what all the nutrients were, and they set this big, huge setup, and then it was costing them more money than they were getting out of it. And so they gave it to us, tax write-off, donated it. And that's one of the greenhouses I ended up running, because they didn't look at what they were producing versus what it was costing to produce it. So look at that carefully if you're thinking about a greenhouse. What are you going to use it, and how are you going to use it? So greenhouse crops. Now this is not in your sheet. I just added this last night. and I apologize because this is pretty good information. You can have either a warm or a cool greenhouse depending upon what you're going to grow. If you're going to have a warm greenhouse, your tomatoes need temperatures between 60 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Now when I say hand pollinate here, with tomatoes you can go through, and if you have the tomatoes tied on a string, you can just shake the string and the physical movement of the flower will pollinate. It self-pollinates. So you can go through, and that's what I used to do. We had a whole greenhouse of tomatoes, and we used to just, once a day I'd go in there and I'd grab the wires and I'd just give them a good shake. And we had lots of tomatoes, good, you don't have to hand pollinate, go from flower to flower and think that that's what's necessary, yes?
If the humidity is a little too high, the pollen won't fall very well.
Right, which is not a problem down where we were at, but it might be in some areas, it might be up
If
here.
you ventilate for 10 or 15 minutes, then it's usually dry enough to pollinate.
Very good point, thank you, Charlie. Eggplant needs a lot of warmth, 65 to 75 degrees is the growing range that it likes. Cucumber, beans, these are the sorts of things that you might grow in a warm greenhouse. But it may be up here where it gets so cold during the winter that it costs you too much to heat your greenhouse. You might, in that case, consider to have a cool greenhouse where you're growing beets or cabbage family, carrots, lettuce, spinach. Spinach is very hardy. It can even tolerate freezing. I was surprised. I didn't get all my spinach harvested last year, and it went through the winter and came out. It was covered with snow, and this spring I look out the window when the snow melted, and there's my spinach, just looking great. I was surprised. I hadn't gone through a winter like that when our pipes froze, and it was zero for quite a long while there. And that spinach made it through, and it'll do even better in a greenhouse. And you don't have to keep it near as warm. Notice the temperature. 40 is the low temperature on most of these, 45. And that's a little more doable than if you're trying to keep it at 65. There's a big difference between those two temperatures as far as the heating needs. So think about what you want to grow in your greenhouse, and even if all you want to do is extend the season, meaning you want to start your plants early in the year, start February or March, you got your greenhouse going, and you can start harvesting crops before you can even think about planting outside. Or in the fall, you can plant your stuff in the greenhouse and let it carry into the fall. When the temperatures start to drop, you lose your garden, but you can still carry on in the greenhouse for another month or two perhaps with careful planning. And there are other things you can do to make it economical to run a greenhouse even during the winter. Greenhouse types. By the way, before I get to greenhouse types, let me just talk a little bit about pest control, because I really don't deal with that in this greenhouse talk. But pests can be a problem in the greenhouse even more than out in the garden, because the first thing to get in your greenhouse will be the bad bugs. And the chances of the good bugs slipping in sometimes are nil, because we have our greenhouses all nice and tight or whatever, and we slip in and out, and the good ones don't get in there. And so all of a sudden you have a problem with some sort of a pest in there. And some of the main pests that you have down where I was at, whitefly is a big one. And whitefly is very resistant to pesticides. Typically what you end up doing with whitefly is if you spray a pesticide, you may get 1 or 2 treatments and then they get resistant to it. And you have to switch to something else if you're trying to use chemicals. However, I was in California when I was running the greenhouse, I was using the trichogramma wasp to control the whitefly, and it took me about 2 years to figure out when to release them and how much to release, and I got perfect control of the whiteflies. No problem. And you want to have a few flowers in the greenhouse just to give the wasp, because the wasp doesn't eat the whitefly, it lays its eggs on the whitefly. The wasp eats pollen, feeds on pollen and nectar. So you want to have some flowers in your greenhouse. And another problem that we have is the spider mite, with tomatoes especially. Boy, I'd have tomatoes that were just covered red with these red two-spotted spider mite. And again, there is a predatory spider mite, and you can order these through the catalogs that you can release, and the predatory mite will eat the bad mite, the spider mite. But you have to release it at the right time, and it may take a year or two for you to figure out when to release them. Now with the spider mites, I got real good control in my first greenhouse, but the second greenhouse had a big section where it was open, and I never was able to get good control there. But it is possible to control a lot of your pest problems using beneficial insects. And that way you don't walk into the greenhouse wearing a big chemical suit because you're spraying to try to control these bugs. I even released these green lizards, the anoles, is that how you call them? They're lizard, and you just release those and they go through, and you rarely ever see them, but they go around. I'd see one run out here and grab a little bug and eat it, and I mean, so there's different things you can do to keep the pest problem under control, even in your greenhouse, without using a lot of chemicals. Types of greenhouses, you can have a cold frame for starting your plant early in the season, providing protection from adverse climate. Here's a little cold frame. And another picture of a cold frame. These, you can build these easy enough. Attached greenhouse. This utilizes an existing structure for part of the wall, so they're usually not very expensive to make. Here's a picture of one here's a house or a trailer, I guess, and they've added this little lean-to like greenhouse to the side of it. And some people will actually put vents so that they can pull the humidity out of the greenhouse and pull it into the house, and then pull heat from the house into the greenhouse to help keep it warm. Or during the summer, they pull the heat out of the greenhouse using a vent here at the top, and you can get the solar operated vents that work by temperature. You don't even use electricity. It'll work by the expansion and contraction of a material inside. Oftentimes they use wax. Some of them use a type of oil. And so even when you're gone, it'll open the vent when it gets hot, and then when it cools, it'll close it. So you don't even have to be around to make sure, but it'll work automatically for you. Even if there's no power, it'll work. Small freestanding greenhouse for small-scale gardening use. I would love to have one like that. It's kind of a cute looking greenhouse. Here's one, the Quonset hut style. Yeah.
They're great.
Oh, you have one like that?
Similar.
I thought yours was a little like that. I didn't think yours had the little things at the top here, but that's even a little, I don't know what that is at the top. Maybe it's to keep birds from landing on it. I'm not sure. Okay. Actually, this is a Gothic arch. It's not a Quonset hut. And here's another series of freestanding greenhouses. Yeah, of course, you can get your larger ones. That's kind of a poor picture. Here's a different one. A large commercial-style greenhouse. If any of you get into that, that'll be quite exciting, I suppose. Any of you planning on having a big, huge operation like that? But there are a lot of people that will go into greenhouses in a big way, and you can do well with that if you know what you're targeting and handle it properly. Solar greenhouse is kind of a different type of greenhouse than the one we've seen, and that's what I'm interested in, maybe building it on my property as a solar style greenhouse. They're usually custom built, so it's not like you can just get a solar greenhouse kit. There's several different designs for solar greenhouses. If properly designed, it can reduce your heating and cooling costs of the greenhouse by quite a bit. And here's a picture of a typical solar greenhouse. You usually face them in the southern direction, meaning the glazing, the glass is facing south, because during the winter the sun is low on the southern horizon. And you usually angle the glass so that during the winter the sun goes straight through at a 90-degree angle, so you don't get any reflection of light. As much light as possible passes through the glass and into the greenhouse to warm it up. And inside the greenhouse, you usually have some sort of a heat storage system. Like in this case, they have a wall with some rock or gravel. You can have a wall with water in black plastic bags to absorb the moisture, to absorb the heat. There's other systems you can use as well. Heat tends to rise to the top. So what they will do is underneath here, they'll build a rock bed at the bottom, and you'll put a little vent at the top with a fan that turns on and sucks the warm air down and puts it in the bed at the bottom. And then during the night, the fan will reverse and pull air back through that hot bed and put warm air into the greenhouse to keep it warm. There's a lot of different ways that they handle this. There's a lot of different techniques. Sorry, I need a drink of water. I'm almost done and I'm running out here. So during the winter, when the sun is low on the southern horizon, the light passes straight through. But during the summer, notice, it hits the glazing at an angle, because during the summer, your problem is overheating. So the sun is high, and this side here is insulated. It has, in this case, I think it has soil on top, and the sun passes through, and some of it is reflected, and it hits the bottom of the greenhouse. It doesn't hit the heat storage section. And you vent the heat out of the greenhouse to keep it cool. So what a solar greenhouse is really designed to do is to, during the winter, collect as much heat as possible and then store it and release that heat during the night or during cold periods. And it can go, a well-designed solar greenhouse can last through a couple of days of cloudy, stormy weather. 4 days maybe at max. All right. So after that, then you would have to think about supplemental heating. If you live in an area where you might get a storm that lasts a week or real heavy snow and so forth. But it can really cut down on your heating and your cooling bill if you run that greenhouse year round. So and there's a lot of different styles of solar greenhouses, but this is what I'm interested in building at my house. Something like this. Another quote, as the husbandman prunes the branches of the fruit-bearing trees that they may bear more fruit, so the Lord prunes those who are endeavoring to serve him, often by pruning away the unhealthy growth of temporal and secular interests, which endanger heart and character. He causes pain. But he works with no wanton hands and indifferent heart. It is in love to his children that he cuts away the growth which threatens to destroy the health and life of the soul. So we're talking about pruning, and really this is where my friend Charlie here has helped me a lot to learn about pruning up here. I did pruning down in California, but a slightly different type of pruning because we had different types of trees. I had never seen hardly a cherry tree, and so Charlie gave me tips on that and some other things. What pruning does is it helps keep your tree at a manageable size, and it reduces your fruit number but increases fruit size to a point. Meaning, somebody once asked me if I prune enough, can I have a fruit the size of a watermelon? And that's usually not possible. There's a genetic stopping point at which a peach will reach a certain size, and you just can't get them any bigger than that, all right? But up to a point, you can have either a lot of real small fruit, or you can have fewer but larger fruit. The type of pruning you do will depend on the variety. And there's a lot of different varieties, but I'm going to give you just some general guidelines. And the purpose of this is to say it's better to prune than not to prune to some extent. Charlie's nodding his head yes, and I'm glad you are, because pruning in general will help your tree. And if you try it, even if you're afraid I'm going to make a mistake, it's better to go out and try it and make a mistake and learn and then figure out how to do it right than to not do it at all. The first thing I do is to remove anything that's dead or branches that are crossing and rubbing each other, because that's just a wound asking for a problem. So that's the first thing. When I walk up to a tree and I'm thinking, well, what am I going to do here? I look for something dead, I cut it out, and I look for crossing branches that are rubbing. The next thing I look at is wood. They say that vertical wood produces very little fruit, vertical meaning up and down. You want wood that's at an angle or horizontal, but if it's straight up and down, typically it's not going to give you much. Now that might be important as part of the structure of the tree, but as far as producing fruit, the vertical wood is not that important. So do you take that out or not? What are you doing with your tree? What is your intent? So I look at that. And then you want to open up the tree. Now I had the guy I used to work for down in the Riverside area, he came from Illinois. And his saying was, you want to prune a tree so that a bird can fly through without touching its wings to the branches. And then he would always modify that and say, and I'm talking about a normal bird, not a California condor. Okay? California condor with a, So I put that in here so that you get an idea. You open the tree up, because all of you have probably seen trees with a thicket of branches, so thick that a bird couldn't even fly through there. And you want to open that up. Am I doing okay on this?
You're doing wonderful.
I have great respect for Charlie. I pruned with him last year. He had me helping him on some trees, and I learned a lot pruning with him. And so I feel kind of awkward standing up here talking about pruning, when Charlie's sitting here, who could tell you so much more because he's had years of experience doing it. It's usually done in the winter or early spring when the trees are dormant. Now, there are some areas where they do what's called fall pruning or summer pruning, usually in areas where you don't get the real cold dormant period.
And you never do that to the pitted fruit. It dwarfs and makes the life of the tree very short.
Okay. Yeah, and I think you're right. I remember reading that somewhere. But it can be done with some of the other
Oh, all the
apples and pears and stuff.
And cherries can stand summer cutting,
Okay.
but not peaches, nectarines, or apricots.
Okay. I should add that on here. Thanks. Now this is one of the last things, is I made this little graph so you can see the range of options here as far as pruning. And I have on one side no pruning, and then on the other side severe pruning. And with no pruning, you'll usually get lots of small fruit with little vegetative growth because the tree is putting all its energy into producing fruit. And you'll typically have alternate bearing, meaning the tree will produce a lot of fruit one year and the next year a lot of vegetative growth, and then you'll get a lot of fruit, a lot of vegetative growth. Because what happens is it's putting so much energy into the fruit. Most fruit trees put their flowers and fruit on new growth from the previous year. And if there is no new growth the previous year because of all the fruit, then the following year it's going to do all this growing with no fruit. Follow? Okay. Over here with severe pruning, you'll have no fruit and it's all vegetative growth because the tree is trying to regrow all this pruning that you did. You cut it way back, and so you have a little tree with a big root system, and it's going to just want to grow very vigorously. You can take like an avocado, a huge tree, 50, 60 feet tall, 30 feet wide, and you can cut that thing off at ground level, and believe me, it is going to grow like crazy. It's going to send up sprouts everywhere out of that trunk, and it's going to take about 3 or 4 years before you see a single avocado because it's just trying to regrow and match the vegetation above the ground with all this root that's left below ground. See? So severe pruning is the other extreme. And what you really want is something in the middle. Well, maybe not necessarily in the middle, but you want to do enough pruning so that you have fewer but larger fruit, and it helps regulate the bearing. Because if you do it right, proper pruning, the tree will always be not only producing fruit, but it'll be producing vegetative growth, and that vegetative growth that year will flower and have your fruit the following year. And so by continuing to prune the tree properly, it kind of evens out that alternate bearing so that you're always having new growth for the fruit the following year, and it's not overproducing. You have fewer fruit, but bigger. And by opening up the tree, you have other advantages as well, in that you get good light penetration into the tree, fewer disease problems, and so forth. And here's a picture of Charlie's handiwork. He did a little grafting at our house and used electrical tape. I thought that was so clever. I had never seen that done. I use green tape down where I'm at, down where I used to be. And the graft is working well. And that's it.
One tip you could add. Some varieties, like Rome apples, for instance, if you nip the tips of every branch, you won't have any fruit because the fruit is a tip bearer. And so that if you are thinning and cutting back a Rome, you only want to cut about half of the branches back and leave the tips on some of the others, or you won't have any fruit on the year you nip them all back.
Right. And see, that's where you need to know a little bit about the variety that you have, because you have spur bearing and you have tip bearing with apples. And apricots, there are different ways of pruning apricots. So, you know, and we can't cover each one of I can't cover each one of those.
No, there's way too many.
There's way too many, but the start is it's better to prune than not to prune, and then you start doing some research. What trees do you have? What variety do you have? How do you handle them? And you can end up being an expert pruner if you just keep at it. Now, we had a question back here.
Yeah, I've read that summer pruning, especially with apples, will reduce the water sprouting. I've never had the courage to try it, but I wondered if that works and when you do it and how you do it.
Summer pruning? In the longer climate, like the Walla Walla Basin, it's usually August 1st to the end of August is summer pruning, cutting out stuff that has no fruit on it. And here locally, you can start a little earlier, like the middle of July onward to the middle of August, because our fall comes earlier. So you have to have, summer pruning has a dwarfing effect and has a fruiting effect thereby. And if you can force fruiting the following year, then you'll automatically have less growth, as he mentioned, on the fruiting year. So that's just mid-season, cut back the suckers and stuff.
So it actually works.
It works wonders. Every other year fruitful tree can be made to fruit every year by summer pruning on the heavy fruit year.
Okay.
Plant stakes, use the mini blinds.
What?
For plant stakes,
Oh, really?
mini blinds, it's right, you know, you cut them and you can ride on them.
There you go. Did everyone hear that about using mini blinds for your plant stakes? And you just cut them, and they would last a long time. That's a good idea. And then you write on them. I would still use one of these ink pens because the ink lasts a long time.
You can use popsicle sticks too.
Yeah. And by the way, these ink pens, they come in different colors. I found the blue will fade, just doesn't last very long, but the black lasts a long time. Somebody else had I thought I saw a hand. You had a hand? Oh, no.
Just now put it.
Okay, all right.
We have some new trees, apple trees, and the bloom up, the flowers concerned because weather's been too cold for the bees to come pollen. Is there any way they can be artificially pollinated?
No, I don't. How new are they? When did you plant them?
Well, they're just about that high. They just
Because usually if you just planted the fruit tree, you want it to go for 2 seasons at least before you want it to bear any fruit anyway. So you wouldn't want it to set any
Scripturally,
fruit.
we wouldn't until the 5th year, except for to give to the priest and the widow and the fatherless.
Yeah. So
we have some other trees too that are older.
yeah, now are they doing the same thing or?
Yeah, they've flowered out, but he's concerned because it's so cool. What do other people do with their orchards?
We have lots of bees there.
We have bees.
Yeah, well then
Vines.
what I would do is just walk out and see if you have any small fruit that have set or not. But it may be too late to do anything about.
Bunch of them.
You just can't empty a jar of bees or something on it.
Well, put a fan on it and see what happens.
Now there are bee attractants that some people use that you could spray in your orchard that's supposed to bring bees and help with pollination. They use that actually a lot with avocados simply because the bee does not like the avocado flower. And so if a bee has a list of flowers that it likes, the avocado is at the bottom. And so what they do with avocado grows, because bees are essential for pollinating the trees, is they will actually saturate the grove with so many bees that they use up everything else and they have to go to the avocado. And they also will spray this bee attractant to try to get the bees to go to it. By the way, avocado honey is very thick and wants to crystallize, but it's very expensive. It's a gourmet item because the avocado has two unique sugars, mannaheptulose and perseitol, and they have found that those sugars are effective against cancer. And so some people are using avocado honey, trying to get those sugars into their system.
Can you do it by eating the avocado?
It's not, there's very little of it in the avocado, but you can get it in the honey. And it gives the honey a different flavor. And by the way, those two sugars are only found in avocado. It's kind of interesting. I don't know how the evolutionists would explain that, but they would find a way. Yeah, you're right. They're not only just unique sugars, but they have people that are working on trying to artificially make those sugars, and they haven't been able to do it. They're very complicated for some reason. They can't seem to make them.
Do you know anything about the seasoning saffron, and can you plant and raise it?
Saffron, yeah, it's a bulb. It's a crocus.
You can get
And
bulbs from
you
the
c-
nursery.
Yeah, they have different places you can get the bulbs, and you just have to collect. It's the male part of the flower, the stamen. Stamen. The pistil's the female part in the middle. It's the stamen, and you go out and you collect them. And the problem I've understood is that oftentimes when those flowers open is during the time of year when you have a lot of rain, and so that can be an issue with trying to collect it. But yeah, you can grow it here, and just like crocus grows well in your garden, the saffron crocus will do well up here.
Well, I've heard it's very expensive to buy.
It is very expensive to buy, and partly because you have to collect it by hand, when you're harvesting it, and so it's very expensive per ounce. It's like $900 an ounce or something like that. It's